Of virtual FDA inspections, what you need to know to be prepared. My name is Brian Malkin, and I'm FDA counsel here at Arent, where I counsel clients on all types of FDA-regulated products, including drugs and biologics, animal drugs, biologics, medical devices, foods, dietary supplements, cosmetics, tobacco products, and even new areas such as cannabis. I'm very excited to be hosting today's webinar today with Jack Garvey, CEO of Compliance Architects, LLC, and Dan Barreto, President and CEO of PharmQ Global Consulting. And just to give you a little background, I was thinking about this program for quite some time, at the very beginning in March when COVID hit, thinking about what's happening with product development. And my concern was really that companies can continue to get products approved, can continue to have their pre-approval inspections. And so thinking, what is FDA going to be using as their tools, and trying to look what FDA has been saying. They're not saying a lot, as many of you know, why I hope you're tuning in today. So I reached out to these two experts, two friends of mine, Jack and Dan, who know this area cold, and just so we could brainstorm and think about what those ideas would be. And I think you'll find the discussion very enlightening and interesting. Before we get started, I wanted to encourage everybody to submit questions, as we will try to make this as interactive as possible. And so what you can do is there's a Q&A tool on the right-hand side, and we're going to be monitoring, and particularly myself, to see questions coming through during the presentation in its entirety. You don't have to wait through anything. And we'll follow. If you have questions you want to follow up with us later, our contact information will be at the end, and you'll get a copy of the slide decks to do that as well. Note that matters discussed today are for informational purposes only, and not for the purposes of providing legal advice. And so let's get started. So next slide, please. So next slide. So I already gave you a bit of my background. I was sorry, go back one slide. I'll be very brief. I've been in the practice for more than 25 years in food and drug law. I started my career at FDA. In fact, that's where I met Dan when I was working at FDA. And I was there from 1991 to 2000. I've worked now and a complement of drugs primarily and biologics and medical devices, but I work through all new product lifecycle management and generic drug applications, biosimilars, and I'm also an IP attorney. I went back to school to get a biochemistry degree after working quite a bit in the drug and pharma space, seeing the need to sort of combine the two, which is why I have the BS in biochemistry, as well as at JD and George Washington. And so I counsel clients with both strategies and that in mind. And so next slide, please. I'll let our speakers introduce themselves.
Thank you, Brian. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you to Arent for coordinating this. My name is Jack Garvey. I'm the founder and chief executive officer of Compliance Architects. I know Brian through his work with the New York State Bar Association, where he heads up the food, drug, and cosmetic practice section. And I know Dan from our work together at Johnson & Johnson. So, we do know each other going back a number of years. I'm a chemical engineer by original training. I'm also an attorney. And I focus my work, practice, for lack of a better way to describe it, really around everything from late stage commercialization through what I call supply chain regulation, into post-market surveillance and post-market activities. In particular, enforcement remediation, 483s and warning letters, import detection, inspection readiness and preparation, quality systems, regulatory submissions. I do a lot of work with risk management, risk analysis, computer-based systems, and writing for compliance, which is one of my passions. So thank you, Brian, for the introduction and for the opportunity.
Great. Next slide, please.
Well, thanks, Brian and Jack. It's a pleasure as well for me to be here this afternoon. As you see, I'm the president and CEO of PharmQ Global Consulting, a company that I just opened a few months ago. The areas where we focus the most is in the areas of compliance support and remediation, which is something that we are very passionate about. We also spend a lot of time on quality systems, simplification and improvement. We think the quality systems, since these are areas that FDA pays a lot of attention to. And then, of course, working on an end-to-end inspection readiness and support, something that supplements and complements what Jack's companies does. How do we come here to this point? Well, 42 years plus of combined FDA and international experience in the pharmaceutical industry, working with companies in Europe, Asia. I consider myself to be more of a expert generalist, because we can handle things, whether it's an API, sterile form, or a combination drug product. So I'm very glad to be here, and looking forward to a very fruitful discussion this afternoon.
Great, thank you. Next slide, please. So we're gonna give you a brief background on just sort of the backdrop of where we get to with what are inspections and what virtual inspections maybe look like, some pros and cons, and then we're going to get into some specific questions for you guys, and probably that's where we're going to see you asking them. But the beginning is just to give you an intro, so we're sort of all on the same playing field. So first of all, what did FDASIA tell us with inspections? This is sort of the most updated version where it talks about what might happen for virtual inspections, what tools might be available. So Section 706, and it allows FDA to basically ask for documents upon request. Now it is focused on drugs. 707 would say that it would be, your product would be misbranded if you deny or limit or deny entry to inspections to FDA. And it talks about in 712, FDA has the ability now to rely upon foreign government agency inspections. Again, this is for FDA realizing that it can't be everywhere all the time. They're getting to a point where there's more mutual trust and recognition of other regulatory bodies and the way that they conduct inspections, and more akin to the way FDA would conduct them. And I can tell you, back in the 90s, there's a lot of pushback from FDA relying on other countries, but they're getting better at their International Conference of Harmonization. We're getting to a point where FDA is trusting more regulatory bodies. There's also Section 716 that talks about extraterritorial jurisdiction over violations of law in other areas for imports and inspections. And so again, these are some more authorities that FDA just has to draw upon. Next slide, please. An important area that we thought we want to touch upon in the context of a virtual inspection, if FDA is not going there, what kind of data are they going to rely on other than the actual documents that they have? So it's going to be, in our views, we thought it'd be important to talk about how does FDA view photographs, and sort of what is the law that's out there on it. And so FDA, this is sort of FDA's take. If you look at the bottom here, it's their guidance. It came out back in 2014 after FDASIA. FDA basically was saying that they believe that they have the authority to take a look at photographs and ask for photographs. They certainly can do it after they go and get a warrant in court, but this is sort of even before they do that, the idea that they have the idea to request photographs. And so the question would be, what happens if you don't provide those photographs to FDA? How would FDA sort of view them? And what kinds of things would be appropriate? Next slide, please. So the real question that comes into place, certainly being a lawyer at a law firm you may get as a consultant, is, can FDA require those photographs without a warrant? And so at Section 704 of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act talks about how FDA, the inspector, has the authority to inspect, and these are always the catchwords that FDA uses: reasonable times, within reasonable limits, in a reasonable manner. And so, and what do they have a right to look at? Pertinent equipment, materials, containers, and labeling, if it's done in a reasonable manner. And it extends to all kinds of things: records, files, papers, processes, controls, and facilities. And for FDA to determine whether the facilities are preparing things correctly, or whether the products are adulterated, misbranded, or otherwise violative. Next slide, please. So we're getting back to thinking about what kinds of things can FDA look at, what kinds of things can't they look at? These are questions that come up when inspections occur, and all of us would get these questions, Dan, Jack, or I, in terms of, FDA is at our doorstep. What do we have to give them? What can't we give them? And there's a lot of times companies want to be compliant, but at the same time, they want to know what don't they have to provide. So things they don't need to provide are financial data, sales data, shipment data, pricing, personnel files, other than files that show that people have the authority, appropriate qualifications for doing their jobs. Research data doesn't need to be done, and internal inspections that companies do, their internal audits, they don't have to provide them, but obviously you can provide them if you wanted to. Now, it doesn't explicitly authorize or mandate camera equipment. So back to FDA's guidance, where FDA is sort of trying to extend their arm and saying that they have the rights now to get photographs. They generally have placed it on these two different cases that we have listed here for you, Dow Chemical v. US and US v. Acri Wholesale. Now, Dow Chemical, it was an aerial observation that FDA had. So it was something in plain sight that they had to go, that they could see on the outside. They didn't have to go into the building. So that may not be so authoritative, and perhaps my opinion and some others. And then the second case, the photographs were basically allowed when FDA asked for photographs. So sort of a general rule of thumb is if FDA asks for something, even if it falls into a list of things we talked about, you don't have to provide them. Now they have them. And once you give it to them, it's data that they can work with and use and analyze. So you have to sort of think internally before that happens. What are you going to provide to the agency? Who's going to provide it? And really prepare for inspections before they occur, just like we're talking about today, the possibility of a virtual inspection. Next slide, please. So what are sort of typical inspections to think about? Next slide, please. So there are different kinds of inspections that FDA is going to do. I mean, when you talk about a virtual inspection, when is FDA going to come in? They're routine. There are ones that are for cause because they're adverse events that the agency is aware of, or for product recalls they're aware of. Directed if there's specific information requests, and they could be pre-approval for the product. And so there are different kinds of actions that can come out in terms of how they get classified after the inspection. No action indicated, voluntary action indicated, official action indicated. And typically what will happen, a lot of times you'll get something like a warning letter if there are issues you need to address, and a written response to an establishment inspection report.
Brian, this is Jack. I think it's important to add here that the bulk of the experience surrounding inspections, and probably 99% plus, is tied into on-site inspections. So the topic we're talking about experientially is very, very new and actually primarily speculative, really. So the bounds surrounding on-site inspections are well established and well understood between industry and FDA. With respect to things like photographs, you would think that after all these years it'd be more explicitly bounded. It's not, but what we're moving into, I think, is it's important for the audience to understand it's really a new area to look at. So I just thought I'd throw that in.
And that's a good point, Jeff. Definitely. And that's why we raised it up front in the beginning. Next slide, please. Enforcement, I mentioned a little bit of the warning letter enforcement action. There's a 483. Those are generally the list of all the non-compliant actions from your good manufacturing practices that will come up. FDA there can be different kind of recalls for products. If there's an issue, voluntary, FDA can request them, or they can be ordered. There are different categories of where they go that can result in product delays or withdrawals, product delays for going to the market or not getting on the market, or criminal actions and penalties. Next slide, please. The next slide, please. So now we're getting to sort of the nitty-gritty of what's going on and why we're thinking about virtual inspections in the first place. So what has FDA said about it? So FDA said that except for mission-critical inspections, foreign and most domestic inspections, they were going to be postponed. This is back in March when COVID started hitting and everybody was working remotely. And then they said they think about it case by case. So again, this is what they're saying. The next thing is they said they'd use alternative tools and methods to help prevent the impact on product reviews and other responsibilities. And I think what we saw initially happening, particularly in the generic drug space, there was a whole slew of approvals coming through, and the same thing with the new drugs. And the most recent articles that are coming out, I think even just this week, they're talking about slowdowns in approvals, which is not unexpected because if you can't inspect and do a pre-approval inspection, you can't go on the market. So things were going to slow down, but the initial phase of approvals probably came from FDA, and this is my opinion, being at home, having more time to work on their applications without distractions from the day-to-day life meetings that they run to when they're at FDA. And so that initial uptake was that time that they had, but now that they're not getting the data from the inspections to move forward. Next slide, please. So here's some other things that FDA talked about that they would be able to use, and this is the sites are provided here at the end where we got some information from. They said they can deny the entry of unsafe products into the US instead of doing an inspection. They could use this predictive risk-based evaluation of dynamic import compliance targeting system called PREDICT and try to figure out risk scores of what kinds of things have the most potential for risk coming in. They could use physical examination, product sampling at the borders. And they could also especially target companies that they know have a history of having violations in the past or high-risk ventures, let's say for an international mail facility, something that came into the US they hadn't seen before, for example. The agency could look at the reviews of the facility's previous compliance histories and determine which companies are most at risk for products that would be non-compliant. They could increase their foreign sharing of information of the mutual recognition through confidentiality agreements with other foreign bodies. And they could request records in advance. I mean, they could be trying to do a pure records inspection, and we're going to talk a little bit about what that might look like. And they could also monitor drug supply chains to look for potential issues in disruptions or shortages or counterfeit products. Next slide, please. So here are some quotes that came through back in March, and they just talked about how inspections are just one tool that FDA can use. So in the very beginning, before saying FDA is going to conduct virtual inspections, FDA was saying, there's just one thing that we could do as an inspection. We're going to think about other ways of trying to get at that same information we get from an in-person inspection. So, and they talked about how they're trying to mitigate the impact of new and approved products coming on the market in lieu of that. And so that's sort of that's basically, they're going to look at the totality of information that they have to determine whether they really need to go and inspect a company or not. And that's sort of the FDA's approach in general, the totality of information. Next slide, please. I mean, this is something, Dan, you could give us some feedback for how you put this together in terms of some of what a records inspection might be looking like or how FDA looks at those.
Yeah, if you don't mind, could we just go back for a second to the previous slide, because I think it's important to make some very important comments here, because this goes to the heart of this discussion. Number one, it is very important to state to this audience that in-person inspections are on hold, and we just don't know how long it's going to be before the actual in-person inspections will be used. So as you've clearly stated already, FDA still needs to meet its statutory obligations. There are outstanding warning letters out there. There are new products that are awaiting to be approved. So the FDA has to find a way to make sure that it can assess, the quality, compliance, and feasibility of, whether it's a site or a product to really make it to commercial production and to commercial distribution. So you clearly stated that also the FDICSHA does provide those tools for what we call, virtual inspections. Now, what does a virtual inspection generally include? So I think FDA has very clearly stated that they're going to be looking into, for instance, a company's history of performance. So they're going to do a look back. They're going to see whether or not, in order to do a virtual inspection, that history of performance of that company actually allows FDA to be comfortable about doing a virtual inspection. FDA will also look at information from other authorities, and as you know, there are mutual recognition agreements out there. So those inspections that have been conducted by other authorities are also information that FDA will use to assess the extent to which it can grant a certain a release to a company to do whatever. So I think that what's important here to mention is that as soon as FDA starts asking for records, even if they're not at your site, you need to assume that there is an inspection that is ongoing, an inspection that has started, and you really need to prepare for it. So what we're recommending here is that you need to assess your compliance status to determine what the potential outcome could be for an agency decision. But I think there are two important questions that every company should ask, and one of them is, do I qualify for a virtual inspection based on that inspection history, based on the reputation and credibility that I have before the FDA? And if I do not have that credibility, that reputation, then what do I do in the meantime? Because if you have a warning letter that is awaiting resolution, or if you have a pre-approval inspection that it's awaiting, you're going to have to think about what you need to do to guarantee that then your site gets inspected. So now,
Right,
yes?
No, along those lines, we just got a question that came in related to what you're talking about, Dan. The question was about whether FDA is going to be using their risk-based inspection scheduling in the same manner, or it will be different when they look at a virtual inspection.
Well, that's a very good question, a very important question. And from my perspective, FDA has already started to use the risk-based approach to inspections. So, so they do have some kind of an algorithm out there where they can define and decide what sites should be inspected on a certain frequency and for what purpose. And I honestly believe that the virtual inspection process will be equally it will equally follow some kind of a risk-based approach. So if you do not qualify because the FDA does not believe that you have that technical credibility, does not believe that, let's say, you have the facilities, does not believe that without looking at your facilities, at your people, at your procedures on site, that you should not be given a VI. I think that's the way it's going to go. So that's my perspective, and this is why this is so important for every company that is out there. But I'd like to get Jack's perspective on this as well, because I think this is an important point.
You're on mute, Jack. Sorry.
Thanks, Brian and Dan. So Dan is, as you know, we had some preparatory discussions for this. So Dan and I have a little different perspectives on both the value and the risk of what is being called virtual inspections. I think it's important to understand that risk-based planning for the FDA is it's certainly something they have to do because they don't have adequate resources to cover their statutory obligations of inspecting sites every 2 years. So they've got to do something. They've struggled with it, however, with respect to quality metrics, which was going to be a very important part of that risk-based planning. And the other thing I'll offer is that, I've had many discussions with company executives that by definition, every company that went through a major enforcement remediation, went through an enforcement activity, had an inspection prior that was fine. Otherwise, the major enforcement action would have happened prior. So I think it's for the agency, I think it's risky from a public health and public policy perspective to rely on the past inspectional outcomes because they're very, very investigator specific based. There is not as much calibration as there should be from investigator to investigator. And I think for companies to rely on past inspections as an indicator of their current compliance status is a very risky proposition. That said, with respect to the specific framework of COVID, which is critically important and is an anomaly, of course, I couldn't agree with you more. We've got to keep moving forward, and the FDA, the agency, has to look at risk, whatever information they have, to make those determinations. I don't see it as a normal practice post-COVID, however, for both companies or the FDA. But thank you.
Okay, great. So, so the next slide where we talk about frequently requested records prior to an inspection. I think that, we have already seen that this is a practice that's done for quite a few number of inspections under a pilot program. So you see here that those types of records that FDA will be asking for. If from my perspective, they will use this information to also follow through on whatever visual inspection planning process they're going to do. So I would not be surprised, and you should not be surprised by the types of documents that FDA is requesting to see and review compliance activities. And as you see, all of these records that are requested, they're all performance related. So why is that? Because this is more around the low-hanging fruit. So if you have an investigation management program that is deficient by FDA asking you certain questions on the status of your program, they're going to be able to sort of get an idea as to where you are. So to me, these are entry points for more documents to be requested. So obviously they make that initial request. That initial request will be assessed, right? So for example, a request on investigations could lead to a number of areas to be further explored: rejected batches, calibration failures, maintenance issues, failed validations, among others. But also when they are doing this type of analysis on documentation review, you're going to see that the quality of investigations is also going to be something they're going to be judging. They're going to be judging the oversight role of the quality unit. So if it's not good, that could be in question. So any indications of poor investigations, for instance, would just open up the door for FDA now to be interested in, your CAPA program, CAPAs that were implemented. Do you have recurrent CAPAs, for instance? So I think from my perspective, FDA is learning more and more on how to do remote reviews. The pilot program they did on requesting record cycle time shows that they're able to use, for instance, pivot tables on Excel, and they're going to be analyzing whether or not you have recurrent investigations, whether you have systemic issues with a specific product or a specific area. So I have to say that from a virtual inspection process, if FDA wanted to go this way, they still can do a very effective inspection. I think that's the point that I want to bring. Can we go to the next slide, please? So when you look at the types of observations that are reported, 90% or more of the time of an inspection is really spent on documentation review. I am not underestimating the value of a facility tour, because during that facility tour, the FDA inspectors can see cleanliness of the facility. They can see whether or not there's clutter, there's sufficient space, whether or not operators are following procedures, whether or not you've got QA presence on the shop floor, whether or not the equipment is clean or not, etc. But the truth is that observation that FDA makes during a facility tour usually leads anyways to documentation reviews. So one thing that is important to know is that because 90% or more of the inspection focuses on documentation review, a virtual inspection is just going to be missing the visual part of looking at the facilities and people and certain activities, but it will not miss on looking at investigation reports, CAPA reports, batch production records. And by the way, I strongly believe that documents that today get not so much attention, like annual product reviews and certain validation reports, I think the FDA is going to be spending more and more time because they have the ability to do that. Can we go to the next slide, please? So I want to go to.
Anna, I'd like to follow up at some point on that question when we get to that point.
Oh, do you want to make the comment now? That'll be fine.
Yeah, I think I do. So I think one of the things to realize that when you in the framework that you laid out, that one of the things that you have to consider with respect to what goes on in an on-site inspection, which you've been in many, is that there is context given to the documents. And it's the analogy that I was thinking of is that it would be like dumping a box of evidence that has been collected by prosecutors in front of a jury and asking the jury to sort it out. What on-site representatives of a company do is help provide context and help weave the story of the documents together into a representation of control and compliance by simply providing records in advance. In my mind, is no more effective than dumping documents in front of a jury and having them figure it out. The experts that have control of the documents, i.e. the company, have to give that critical context and do so extensively during the inspection. So I think there is a distinct risk, both for the agency as a public health organization, but more importantly for the companies themselves. And it gets into this idea of whether or not you should encourage voluntary inspections, which I know we've talked about. There are distinct risks from companies to go through a virtual paper-based inspection, that being one of them, context. The second is that much of what FDA reviews, and based on that chart, but even more so, they view what I call negative inference documents. So they review CAPAs, they review deviations, they review complaints, and their objective is to create a negative inference for the purposes of building a case of non-compliance. So the counter to that in an on-site inspection context is the ability of people to represent past that. And the final thing I'll add there with respect to a documentary review only is that I teach a course on writing for compliance. And I can tell you that the documents that are out there that are inspection implicated documents, CAPAs, deviations, investigations, are just not that great. And they don't represent the company's interests well. And in fact, the data we've collected over the years is that 2/3 of all people that are involved with inspection implicated documents have had one or less college course on writing and one or less professional course on writing. So the writing representation that creates the output documents for what would happen in a paper-based or a virtual inspection, I think often doesn't do a great job of representing what the company actually puts in place from a control framework. So thank you for allowing me to interview.
Yes. So Jack, your point is very well taken. I think that the challenge is going to be that in the event that any company is subjected to a virtual inspection, that company really needs to think differently, needs to perform differently, needs to make sure that its inspection management approach considers those points that you're touching.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
that we agree.
Okay, so let's talk about the pros, cons, and considerations. So some of the pros that I see, and you might say these are pros for FDA more than for us in the industry, but there are some pros that I think, for instance, for the companies, one of the things that I always have found that creates a major problem for a company, a site, is the stress level that is caused, especially to operators, people who are on the shop floor. But because they have 1, 2, or 3 FDA inspectors observing, let's say a filling operation, and then all of a sudden these operators and everybody around them feel the pressure and start making mistakes, and then those mistakes eventually get cited as lack of training, inability to follow procedure, et cetera, et cetera. So from a pro perspective, I think that's a very good one, and I think that the second one that I would say is that from my perspective, if FDA applies the virtual inspection program, the good compliance record of every company that is out there will allow them to go through a virtual inspection that it could and it should go to help the company. Now there are some cons that I think are important to keep in mind, and the first one is that for some companies, physical inspections may be the only way to go because, again, their compliance record does not allow them to qualify for visual inspection. So any physical inspection that is taking place, because FDA says I don't think I can give you a virtual inspection, sends a negative signal to that company. One con that I really wanted to share with this audience today is, if a visual inspection takes place and I have 2 investigators in 2 different district offices working together, these 2 investigators could actually ask for other FDA specialists to intervene and help them with specific topics. So let's say the investigator is very good with media fills and it's very good with aseptic processing, but there's a CSV issue and the inspector doesn't know much about CSV. He or she could probably ask another expert from the FDA to actually join that VI inspection for 2 hours, 3 hours, whatever it takes. So I think that there's different pros and cons. I'd like for this slide to sort of get that point. But the considerations that I think are important is that you need to make sure that to understand that a different level and approach of inspection readiness will have to be implemented if you are undergoing a virtual inspection, because the focus is going to be on, you need to put focus on assessing first and foremost the state of performance of delivery of your most critical systems. So, like, for instance, you need to ask yourself these questions. Do you have backlogs in closing, your investigations? And if so, how many and why? Could you explain and rationalize, your backlogs? Because remember, during the virtual inspections, in my opinion, FDA will be asking more and more performance-related information. FDA will be sorting and tracking. And these are the types of questions that you could be getting. So ask yourself these questions. Do your inventory on the performance of your systems. You really have to go over every system. Stability testing, investigations, CAPA program, your validation master plan. Are you up to date on it? And then ask yourself, can you explain why these systems are not performing as expected? If they're not, can you identify the documents from those systems that FDA will more than likely look at when they're doing the virtual inspection? And what does your analysis of those documents indicate? Do I have an isolated issue? Do I have a systemic issue? In other words, I think that it becomes more and more important for any company to basically do the inspection before the inspection takes place. Because if you're not ready to answer these questions, I think that during a VI inspection, potentially the level of patience of an FDA inspector could change. So next slide, please. I think I'm bringing it back to you, Brian, correct?
That's right. A couple questions have come in I just wanted to address to the group. One question was about whether the agency, and this is getting back to sort of our discussion about photographs, and I think we'll get into some discussion potentially about video streaming that might happen, or requests for video streaming that could come from the agency. The question is about whether the agency is currently embracing a virtual tour technology, something like Google Glass, to do a virtual inspection. And I know we talked about that at length. I know we haven't probably encountered, maybe I haven't encountered less a client where they've been asked to do that, but these are things to think about. Where are you guys coming out of? Maybe Jack, I'll let the first stab on that. What would you do if FDA asked one of your clients to do that? What would you advise them?
So first of all, I think it really repeats saying that this is entirely speculative. So FDASIA has been in place since when? 2015, I believe, 2014. And in 2017, FDA put in place their staff manual guide, SMG 9004, which outlined the policy and procedures for requesting records in advance of or in lieu of a drug inspection. And to my knowledge, in talking to my industry peers, and I know we've all talked, and I've even read some other things from other experts, there's almost no examples of people really being able to state that companies have been through a paper-based inspection, a virtual inspection, in accordance with this pre-existing staff manual guide. So the question is, we haven't really even gotten to a point of first use from what I can see, or first critical use, certainly not a routine use of this possibility. So now, to go to your question, I think that if it were me, might be a bridge too far relative to what I would consider under the reasonableness provisions of the statute to request that kind of review. I think that the framework, I'm not sure that the FDASIA 706 even authorizes that sort of a practice. I don't know if that would be considered a record. So I think there's a lot of questions there. I would try to work with the agency. As always, this is not an area that you want to be in a confrontational setting with the agency. On the other hand, I think it's really important for companies to understand the legal limits, working with their counsel, good counsel, people that understand this. Oftentimes, and with respect to ex-agency people, think like the agency, and the agency will move forward policy positions if there is no pushback from the other side. We have embarked on what I would call regulation by assent with respect to a large volume of what is within the regulation. So I think you got to pick your battles always. You should always be collaborative with the agency. You should always understand their goals and objectives. But, I I think I'd have a pause if somebody jumped into a novel technique to conduct an inspection without some basis of why this is valid under the law, why this is valid under their own internal policies, and why this is necessary and reasonable given alternative methods.
And I'll just add to that, based on our discussion earlier on photographs, I did not get into the details here. One of the things that companies have been doing in the past, prior to this context of potential for virtual inspections, if they don't want to provide photographs, what they do is they say, we have a no photograph policy. We don't provide photographs to anyone, not just UFDA, but to anyone. We don't want people take pictures of our facility.
Exactly right.
It's been a way for companies to, in the past, avoid photographs. But now, a question I'll pose this back to Dan is that what happens now with FDA says, that's fine. You don't want photographs. You don't want video streaming. You've given us your records, but your records have suggested some items we need to take further analysis of before we could give you the all clear. If you want to get your product to market, you're going to have to let us do that because we can't come there. Well,
I think,
what's your take on where that leads in, or what have you been hearing from perhaps your ex-FDA perspective, your counterparts of what FDA might be thinking along those lines?
From an FDA perspective, and based on what I've heard and my own personal experience, I think that the question is, what is the balance? It goes back to what Jack was saying. So if somebody says to me, my site, I need to do an FDA inspection, it's going to be a virtual inspection, and I don't want to limit myself to doing a documentation review. I really want to be able to take some pictures, and remember, today FDA looks at smoke studies, right? And smoke studies are video representations of an activity, and they are also perceived to be records. So I think that the question is going to be the extent to which you can actually have a productive discussion with the FDA, because in the end, you want that inspection performed. And I can tell you, if the agency, from my perspective, this is PharmQ, if FDA says we cannot do an inspection without pictures, therefore we're going to cancel this inspection until we have an opportunity to do an in-person inspection, which could take place 3, 5, 10 months down the road. I mean, I would speak with my senior management first and say, look, either we do this or we do that. But if we don't do the pictures taken or the video, certain videos, our product is not going to be approved until 6 months from now. If the company wants to go that way, then that's the way it is. So I think, again, as Jim said, we're venturing into some new territory, but I think, again, we probably need to find the right balance between the two, because the world is changing. I mean, FDA is not inspecting in person right now, and I don't know when will the next FDA inspection be, if it's going to be 2 months, 4 months, 6 months down the road.
That sounds good. So along those lines, we were thinking internally about what are some of the practical considerations. It gets to sort of what would you do in terms of how FDA interprets records. And so one of the things we thought about as advice to provide, or thoughts for folks to think about, is that you want to maintain control of the visit in the virtual format by providing to FDA only the records you're sort of willing to share, the things you think that are reasonable, the things that don't go beyond what you think is not the kind of records we talked about you need to provide. And in terms of thinking about that, we also thought it was important to before we get to this question where FDA is coming in and giving you have this option, virtual inspection or nothing, or we're walking away, or give us your records, and sort of maybe a layered approach where they might take the records first that I think Dan's proposed, and then determine whether they need to have a more in-depth kind of virtual inspection and what that might look like. They might request the records. Think about how you could sort of partition out the records that are reasonable for FDA to have access to, and the ones that you don't want them to have access to, so that when these questions come up, you're readily able to partition them out and provide them in a more controlled format, potentially sort of like in a WebEx, like here, what documents do you want? And then you have them already packaged to provide to them. Next slide, please. We have another question that sort of came in, and along those lines, next slide, please, was asking whether during COVID, and this is something to sort of think about and what might be reasonable, whether you might have a bargaining chip, was a term I use, leverage with the agency in terms of how FDA views your risks, or whether they do an audit for your company because you're making a COVID-19 kind of a product to treat it, maybe a vaccine or a diagnostic. And would that enable you to basically say, give us our time to do our work. We're working on it. We're doing something of a public health interest. Would that be something that might provide a leverage, or especially if they see their stockpiling of certain products and what you're making is vital to be out there in the market? Thoughts from either Dan or Jack on that?
Yeah, Brian, I think that it's a very dangerous mistake for companies to make any assumption or even speculation that their product has such a public health value that FDA is going to give them a pass. I've seen this with many groundbreaking therapeutic entities. A company I used to work for had a $4 billion product they were launching, and they thought that the therapeutic benefits were so great that they could just not really do a great job with commercialization and development robustness. And they paid the price on it. And I've seen other situations with less stakes. I think it's very dangerous to assume that. On the other hand, 2 or 3 months ago, I think, FDA probably would have done anything under public pressure. Things have, they certainly haven't normalized or even stabilized, but we're finding more out about COVID and the disease. So I think that that knowledge would basically kind of counteract the fact that I've got something that's, some magic bullet that's going to really compel action. I would be very cautious for a company. So I would say, no, you need to be prepared with the data. You need to be prepared with your operations. And you need to assume that you've got to basically overcome a burden of proof to the agency as far as this is safe for the American public.
I'd like to say that I totally agree with Jack. And what I have recommended in previous discussions with respect to the COVID-19 situation, and let's say companies finding themselves with certain delays or backlogs that indicate a certain level of, let's say, non-compliance or adherence to a certain program, it's really for the companies to assess what those compliance risks are, and to put together what I call a post, COVID action plan. Show to the agency that these issues that have put you in a very difficult situation, that you have some kind of a compliance action plan moving forward. Because you know what? There are companies out there that are not testing for stability because their laboratories have been closed. The personnel has not been available. They have not been allowed. So it's not their fault that that they have instances of non-compliance from, let's say, a testing perspective. It's not that that was intentional, but what it is going to be expected of them is to say, this is the situation. This is how we intend to compensate for it. This is how, this is a program that we're going to have to get ourselves back. And we also understand the risk. So I think, I agree with Jack, no pass, but every company coming out of the COVID will find itself with a certain level of gaps that they're going to have to explain. And the best way to explain those gaps is really through a compliance action plan.
Thank you. We had another question, and it's sort of related to something that we were thinking about as a question we might ask ourselves. It was about sharing perspectives on pre-approval inspections in a virtual setting. And I'll sort of add to that we were thinking internally in our group about what could FDA choose not to act on a marketing application because it chose not to perform an on-site inspection. So if they've chosen that they can't go on site, and they because the company is too new, for example, maybe it's the very first product they've done, they're a startup company, they've never been inspected before, and we were thinking along the lines of, are there companies who are appropriate for the paper-only virtual inspection or a virtual inspection, and some who simply aren't and would have to be done on site when circumstances so permit that to occur. Maybe I'll throw it back to Dan just for a moment, some thoughts that you might have on that.
Sure. Look, keep in mind, the pre-approval inspection, I always call it the icing on the cake. And so if a company has submitted all its information, FDA could decide, based again on that compliance history of that company, that a pre-approval inspection may not be needed. But given the current circumstances, I see that as one where, FDA could do that type of virtual inspection to sort of demonstrate that not only they have already reviewed all the submission information that was filed, but that they have added a little bit more of extra check to provide that pre-approval inspection, that approval for that new product. So from my perspective, it can be done. It has been done in the past. I've seen instances where FDA has approved a new product without a new pre-approval. Let's say that the company had a pre-approval inspection in January for another product, and that was a VI or NAI inspection. That still should count for that other new product. Again, if it's a new technology, something that, let's say, it's extremely delicate, FDA might say no. But I think I would say FDA will use a risk-based approach as well here.
Jack, what are your thoughts? You're on mute. Sorry.
As Dan was talking, I think that it's really interesting that FDAsia has been around for 5 years, and as I mentioned before, the manual that provides the framework for the Staff Manual Guide 9004 for FDA's conduct has not been used. I think it's really, and actually there was a blog post yesterday by Mark Schwartz from Hyman Phelps. Why hasn't FDA done a better job to outline clearly, particularly given the fact that they've had 3 months of COVID, how they're going to approach this issue? I mean, the messaging that has occurred so far has been extremely light, considering the critical public health considerations that the public health importance that inspections play to the supply of regulated products to the U.S. market. So you really got to ask yourself. The other thing is, most of what we're talking about applies to drugs only, because FDAsia is really a drug statute. So with respect to the other regulated product classes, we haven't really touched on that. And I know we talked about it in advance. We have certainly medical devices. Now, the drug sides will apply to drug combination products and biologics. But, what about just medical devices? We have a huge amount of products that fall into that classification that are critically important to American public health. No discussion really about foods. There's been a lot of activity on food inspections prior to COVID, but what now? So I think that, and if there's anybody from FDA listening, FDA really has to kind of do more than just a couple of public press statements that really outlines what their approach is going to be. Get some meetings with industry, meeting with pharma, meeting with AdMed, and say, look, here's what we're doing. We want to do reasonable inspections. We need to protect the public health. We understand that there are limits on our authority. There are things that you need. Get the stakeholders in a room and bang out what are reasonably agreed upon inspection approaches, because we're speculating in a lot of cases on, the risk-based approaches and what will be viable or not based on current statutory authority. So I think there is a lot of work to do, and I think time is getting short. People are starting to ask questions. That's why we're doing these, why we've done this. What is happening with respect to inspections? And that has to continue.
That's exactly why we're doing this today. If you can move the slides ahead, 2 slides just to our last slide. And then I want to pose a final question that I know we talked about just yesterday. We were brainstorming about what could FDA do in the context of not being able to inspect and get to a facility. And a concept came up when we were thinking about it, is that, companies are still going, pharma companies are still going to their businesses. Certainly essential personnel are. They're still making pharmaceutical products. They're there physically at their site. So we were sort of brainstorming this, and I want to have everyone sort of give some thought about it. What about if could FDA, through its authority, require through, let's say, a third party, now the third party being the company itself, let the company do its own inspection, following FDA guidelines, giving a thorough checklist of what the FDA inspector will be looking at, document those things that the FDA inspector will be looking at, maybe even taking pictures, who knows, right? We don't know. That's another layer to sort of think about, but actually think about the things that FDA would normally do, have the company conduct their own inspection, and then to make it sort of more compliant per se, or making sure things are following it, create, a certain kind of sanction mechanism, whatever that might be, or maybe a warning letter or something more severe for fraudulently or misrepresenting those findings during the inspection by the company. And so what are your guys' thoughts on that? And I'll start back with Dan just to sort of balance things and then go back to Jack.
Sure. Personally, I mean, going back to what Jack was saying, the FDA still has to really define the way to go. So, for instance, I'm expecting that from a virtual inspection guidance perspective, I'm really expecting that FDA it's either working or will be publishing a virtual inspection guideline if that's the way they want to go. So to answer your point, I'm not so sure that FDA would be ready at this point to grant that, let's say, flexibility for third parties to actually do what FDA should be doing itself in something that FDA would be, let's say, already experienced that. So from my perspective, I'm not convinced that that FDA will come up with that type of approach at this point until it has sort of given it a credibility, and that is yet to be established from my perspective.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of problems from a long-term perspective in doing that. I certainly don't think as an interim position that the agencies either request for a company's self-assessment of their own compliance status. I don't see why FDA couldn't ask for that. Certainly there is a, in lieu of language, there is a, it appears to be an interpretation that allows for the agency to ask for documents to be created. I don't know if it would go as far as a self-assessment, but in this time, I certainly think they could ask, and if a company decided they would do that. I certainly don't think the self-assessments are any substitute for a investigator. As far as a third party, there's certainly plenty of qualified third parties out there that could give companies a very, very deep review. On the other hand, we get into the ISO problem. So you've got notified bodies and kind of the payment for services by the companies. I've certainly seen plenty of ISO audits that are not as aggressive by any stretch as the FDA. So I think there's almost as much work that would have to be done to get there. Although I think it could be done. I think really what FDA needs to do as a first starting point is just get on and figure out what is going to be the program to work with what we have right now, with all the regulated product classes, so we can do our best job at getting the information in front of us to determine whether or not these facilities are creating public health risk for the American public. And they can work with the trade associations on that joint objective to make sure that the American public and our representatives are comfortable that they're carrying out their mission under the statute.
Well, great. I think we are up on the hour. That's an excellent, closing to it. And I think that's exactly why we were doing this webinar today for everybody. It's to sort of brainstorm, at least between ourselves, what were some ideas that we had of what FDA should be thinking about. But as Jack and Dan both said, and I agree, we need more guidance from FDA. FDA has had since March. I mean, we're looking at some of the statements we were citing back to here in the very beginning was FDA knew that they'd have to think about other options. The other options are going to get them only so far. The border controls, talking to some companies, and we're getting to a point now where companies are having their PDUFA dates coming up, and maybe get a GDUFA dates, MDUFA dates. All these dates are coming up, and what's going to be the perspective of if you can't get the pre-approval inspection, what's going to happen with this product? We don't want to see the pipeline going slower for other products, and even if the focus is going to be on COVID, which it should be, there's so many other priorities out there too, healthcare priorities, that you don't want to let slide because you're just focusing on COVID, which is another important consideration. You want to see things move forward, and I think all of us, our goals are really to see the most effective way for that to happen, and it's got to start with some guidance and some debate and dialogue. And we hope that today's program gave some good food for thought for the audience. And you have our contact information up here. Please feel free to reach out to anyone, or if you want to reach out to me, to reach out to the panel so we can do it. We can all three of us can opine on something. I think you'll get a good balance of information and back and forth and thoughts on what could happen from our different perspectives. And we're happy to keep that open. And also, if you want, copies of the slide deck will be made available afterwards. And we appreciate you joining us. Thank you, everyone. And to be continued, right, gentlemen?
Yes. Thank you very much.
This is not the end at all.
Brian,
All
are we
right.
staying on?
You guys can stay on. I do need to jump off.